have been often described as overly harsh but honest. It's a personality trait that's gotten me kicked out of a lot of school recitals and wedding ceremonies. However, if there was a medium where I have an unconditional soft spot for, it's anime. I'm not entirely sure where this strange passion for giant robots, over-the-top violence, and 2D boobies comes from, but it's an affliction in which no therapist or medical expert in the country appears to have a treatment for. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am happy to report that those dark days are finally over as I discovered Muv-Luv Alternative, a game that successfully cured me of my lifelong ailment by frustrating me to the brink of insanity. Muv-Luv Alternative is a Japanese visual novel that ambitiously sets itself out to tell a despairing story about an existential war fought by an underdog group of teenagers against an overwhelming alien threat armed with nothing but companionship, giant mech robots, and an interdimensional time machine. Wait a minute, am I reading this right? Who are the underdogs again? Now on the surface, this looks like the kind of thing that would keep me up at night creaming my undergarments. After all, everything I described is essentially the wet dream of any warm-blooded anime fan since the invention of the internet. So why did I find this game so unbearably frustrating? Well, for starters, let's talk about the tone, or rather specifically, the lack of one, for the story can't seem to make up its mind on whether it wants to be a romantic comedy or a serious war drama. Characters would exchange hours of cheerful dialogue gossiping about their classroom activities, literally after we learned that most of the planet's population have been wiped out, and that the average life expectancy for a graduate pilot is about 8 minutes in contact with the enemy. To say that the tone is a total mess would be an understatement. Brexit was a total mess, sure, but the tone in this game is an unmitigated disaster. To make matters worse, the characters themselves are not particularly interesting or original. The cast mainly consists of the usual suspects found on the assembly line. You got every trope ranging from the bossy mean girl to the cringy cat lady, and of course no Japanese game would be complete without your stock standard JRPG pretty boy, whom all the girls are contractually obligated to fall in love with. And while these character tropes are well suited for your typical high school romantic comedy, here in a war story promising despair and the need for therapy, they feel more out of place than a clown speaking at a funeral reception. Pretty boy protagonist in particular has the same character flaws as Shinji, in that he often devolves into a self-pitying pencil sharpener at the convenience of the plot. Now don't get me wrong fellas, I understand the need for having personality flaws in the interest of character growth, but pity is something used to invoke sympathy, yet the writers are clearly trying to portray him as the center of a harem, which obviously demands a charismatic character. And this misguided creative decision inevitably leaves you with an unlikable main character surrounded by fictitious relationships that are only possible if there are no other male alternative. Maybe this was what the writers had intended, as alternative was clearly labeled in the title, and I guess it does explain some of the other baffling choices, like how one formerly male pilot mysteriously had a sex change. The game also adopts an agonizingly lighthearted atmosphere. It's so disconnected from what you normally expect from a despairing war story that you think the writer's only conception of war came from what they saw on the back of a cereal box. All the characters are well fed, given spacious accommodations, and apparently have enough free time to attend school. I'm sorry writers, but I forget. Were we supposed to be in a war-torn city, or have we taken a wrong turn somewhere and wandered onto Sesame Street? Crikey, you think Japan of all countries would know what a devastated city might look like, but clearly these writers have failed their history lessons, so I'm forced to provide some basic common sense. How about you instead station your characters in the remains of a bombed out factory, where daily life involves risky salvaging missions just to keep the lights on? Maybe instead of having your characters constantly joke about what they're having for lunch, you could instead paint a grimmer picture, where food is so scarce that the characters are forced to make hard choices regarding whether to feed the combat staff or the civilian refugees. You know, like a real war. I'm not saying that these changes would address all your problems, but at least it's a start. It would also be a big help if your dialogue doesn't drone on more excessively than a retiree at a supermarket line. I'll show you what I mean. At one point in the story, one of the characters volunteered to sacrifice herself to buy you more time, and the exchange between her and the protagonist went something like this. "It's the only way, I have to do this. But if you go through with it, you'll die. It's my duty to protect everyone. No, there must be another way." And this keeps going for like 10 minutes. Even the Dalai Lama would have been pissed at this point. The writers just don't seem to understand the concept of diminishing returns. It's literally impossible to maintain an elevated emotional state because they keep dragging out a scene past its expiration date. Like, what were they thinking? There are so many famous scenes that were made vastly more engaging by keeping the dialogue to a minimum. Did nobody on the development team bring this issue up during meetings? Or the fact that it took 16 hours of reading before any meaningful conflict occurred in the story? The downtime was so long that I was under the false impression that there might be a more complex plot happening behind the scenes, where maybe the whole alien threat was a hoax conjured up to establish an isolationist nation under military rule. But no, it turns out it was just due to terrible pacing. Well, that's what I get for having high standards, I suppose. I know I won't be making that mistake again. It's pretty obvious that the writers prefer to tell a romantic comedy story instead of a science fiction war story. This would explain why most of the plot threads regarding the aliens are left predominantly in the final 2 chapters, while the majority of the time was spent focusing on the character interactions, which mostly involved some light comedy rather than a setup for some future payoff. And when it was finally time to settle things, the conclusion essentially boils down to, well, the aliens were just too different, and they only see us as a natural resource, so I guess our plan is to blow them up. No, really, that's what they ended up doing. After investing large quantities of resources learning to communicate with the aliens, which involved a ludicrous plan to travel to another universe, the end result was just something straight out of a Roland Emmerich movie. I suppose I should point out that the writers did at least make an effort to add some melodrama by having most of the main characters die in the final chapter, but this wasn't particularly well set up or anything, and rather feels more akin to that awful Game of Thrones episode where the writers realized they didn't know how to wrap up any of the character arcs and just decided to kill off anyone not important to the rest of the story for some pity points. At the end of the day, I found this whole experience to be rather perplexing. It's no masterpiece, but I'm definitely feeling the despair, and honestly I feel sorry for the game. There clearly was a lot of hard work put into the music, voice acting and the CG. It's just too bad it's all in the service of a terrible script. Out of morbid curiosity, I looked up other opinions on Steam and YouTube as part of my routine sanity check, and it appears I'm in a minority here. I guess this is what happens with very niche games. In fact, after doing some further digging, I noticed that the anime adaptation received a more mediocre reception, proving that once you expand the story to a broader audience, the aggregate score drops to something much closer to what I had imagined. A Pyrrhic victory for democracy, I guess.